Well, very pleased to have with us in studio NRA President David Keene. And David, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Always a pleasure.
All right, big story, and finally, everybody is talking about it. It took enough time, but we're finally starting to see the rest of the media focus on Fast and Furious and these
That's right.
scandalous
CBS
allegations.
deserves some credit on this one because they were the first major media outlet to really look into it. But everybody else tried to ignore it. Of course, the administration tried to ignore it, and now it's such a scandal, such a huge scandal, that nobody can ignore it. And thanks for that goes to you, goes to the NRA, and goes to Darrell Issa in the House and those who really decided that this was not something that could just let pass and began the investigation. So I think there's a lot of credit to pass around on this, and a lot of blame yet to be placed.
Oh, absolutely. You know, based on everything you've heard so far, and we know that there are still a lot of questions out there that are unanswered, but based on what you know so far, what is your overall reaction to how big a scam? I mean, you've been around Washington a long time. Is this a minor little blip of a scandal that's going to fade away?
It's not a minor little blip, no matter what the administration might like to say or like to think. This involved over 200 agents, involved millions of dollars, resulted in the death of a federal agent, and there's an obvious cover-up going on because the ATF did not do this on its own, crazy as they can be, without not only orders from above, but informing people from above. Because one thing bureaucrats always do is protect themselves against criticism. So you can bet the folks at ATF were informing people above them that they were doing this.
You know, I've got to ask you, because I talked with Congressman Issa about this, about how when you saw at the hearings some members of the committee really trying to hijack the hearing and talk about, you know, hey, do we need a long gun registry? We've got these toothless laws. And it's interesting because tomorrow Congressman Cummings is holding this quote-unquote forum because he wanted to hold a minority hearing, but they said, no way. And he's out there saying, you know, we've got to do this. And I'm using his words because there's no legitimate examination of this issue will be complete without analyzing our nation's gun laws.
Well, you know, the Washington Post a couple of days
blame
ago
the NRA.
had an editorial blaming the whole thing on the NRA, saying, well, of course they had to break the law. It may have been regrettable, but they haven't got enough laws to do what they want to do. Well, that's a shame. Government is required, and bureaucrats are required to follow the law. And just because you're an anti-gun type does not mean that anybody who does what you might like to do is justified in doing so regardless of the law. The fact of the matter is that this was a runaway attempt, really, and it's hard to. I try not to believe in conspiracies because in Washington, for every conspiracy, there are 300 examples of incompetence and rampant egotism at work. But in fact, you ask yourself, what were these guys up to? Yeah. The administration was claiming that there were all these guns in Mexico that came from U.S. gun dealers. The Washington Post ran a series in which they named some of the people who were being forced by the federal government to sell these guns to Mexicans as major criminals and as a justification for additional gun control laws. And the numbers could never add up. So the administration was, on the one hand, doing this, and on the other hand, using or allowing to be used the numbers of guns that they were pushing into Mexico as an excuse for restrictive gun control proposals in the United States. Now, far be it from me to think that that was their motive, but by golly, they sure used it as justification for going after the Second Amendment.
Yeah. And I just talked with an agent that was fired, and he said that's exactly what it was all about. But, you know, you have President Obama out there saying, you know, hey, Eric Holder, he didn't know anything about it. Do you see this becoming so big that it is going to be an issue on the campaign?
It has to. You know, in crime and in politics, more people get into more trouble from covering things up than from committing the crimes and the blunders. Politicians say something that's stupid and then spend weeks defending what they've said, and as a result, pay a heavy price. Folks who break the law spend a lot of time trying to cover up the initial mistake or the initial law breaking and end up getting convicted for breaking the law. What we have going on here now in the United States government is a massive cover-up. The idea that Barack Obama, the President of the United States, stood up today in response to a question about this scandal and said, well, of course, I didn't know anything about it. Eric Holder didn't know anything about it. It was that guy that's running the ATF who did it. Well, that just doesn't hold up, not given the amount of resources, not given the high profile of this case.
Absolutely.
Obama has claimed, of course, that it's a big government. He doesn't know what's going on. I'm willing to grant that. But the fact of the matter is that I'd be willing to bet money that the knowledge and indeed the direction of this effort went far higher than the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
Well, I guess we're going to find out because you know the word is that Ken Melson is going to testify sometime next month,
And they didn't want him to.
Exactly. And in fact, you know, the amazing thing is we've seen a lot of these stories with anonymous sources being quoted verbatim. You know, one of them was in the Washington Post where you had an anonymous source, presumably from the Department of Justice, claim that Darrell Issa knew about Fast and Furious a year ago. And then we also saw some stories quoting anonymous officials saying that Ken Melson was saying that he wasn't going to be the fall guy. He wasn't going to be thrown under the bus. So we don't know what exactly he's going to say, but it seems pretty clear that this does go beyond his level.
Well, we don't know what he's going to say, and maybe he's the ultimate good soldier and says you can destroy my career and my future and my reputation, and I'll take the bullet for you. The fact of the matter is that's unlikely. Yeah. And regardless of what he says, or regardless of his motives, or regardless of the rumors, the way this government works and the way political appointees work and the way bureaucrats work makes it non-credible to think that they didn't cover themselves at ATF by reporting this up the ladder.
I got to ask you about this editorial in the Washington Post, the Blame the NRA editorial, because their solution to this is to give the ATF more funding.
The power to do this legally.
Exactly. Let's just make it legal to send these guns to Mexico.
Well, the Washington Post, if it had an opportunity, would blame the National Rifle Association for the flooding of Minot, North Dakota. Let's just face up to that fact.
Yeah.
Anything that happens is our fault. That's a given if you're a writer for the Washington Post. But the editorial was both nonsensical, illogical, and obscene, given what actually happened.
Yeah, I've got to ask you because you were talking about this being an important issue, and I know you know there's definitely got to rally the troops out there, but you're already working on that. You're planning the strategy for what the NRA is going to do come 2012. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, the fact is that, as you know, anybody that's interested in and supportive of the Second Amendment has been very fearful of this president and this administration. Barack Obama is a fellow that, before he was in elective politics, was actively involved in attempting to undermine the Second Amendment. He's a man who insulted gun owners during the course of the campaign. He's a man whose attorney general, once appointed and before he went up there for confirmation, told senators that if they had their way, they'd impose all kinds of new restrictions on gun ownership and gun use in the United States. They haven't been able to do that, and now their defense, they're saying, well, why be upset at the president? He hasn't done these things. He hasn't done it because he hasn't been able to.
Absolutely.
Because the NRA and gun supporters, Second Amendment supporters, have been there at every step. The Congress has said, no, don't do it. As you'll recall, 65 Democratic members of the House early on in this administration wrote to the President and the Attorney General after hearing the rumors that they were going to try to assault the Second Amendment legislatively and said, don't do it because we won't be with you. So they haven't been able to do it thus far, but they have harassed licensees. They've used ATF in all kinds of ways. This whole gun runner thing with Mexico and the charge that it's really the NRA's fault that the Mexican drug lords fight with each other. These are all attempts to find some way to either build majority support for additional gun restrictions or to hold on and work at it undercover, or as
below the radar, right?
Below the radar, as the President of the United States told Sarah Brady. If our conclusion, and Wayne talked about this, Wayne LaPierre talked about it at the annual meeting in Pittsburgh, is if this president gets a second term, there are a couple of major things that we can think of. All you need to do is think of taxes, restrictions, regulations, and Supreme Court and United Nations. If he gets a second term, he will try something head-on in the Congress. He may not succeed there. But if he gets an appointment to the Supreme Court, they don't even have to reverse Heller and McDonald. What they can do is that they can say, well, let's say what's reasonable and isn't reasonable. Remember, the extreme version of reasonable restrictions is sort of the Chicago position, which is confiscation is reasonable. They can move that so that the victories that we've had in the Second Amendment become meaningless if they control the Supreme Court. Secondly, they can go through the United Nations. They've already signaled that they do not believe that they will take the position that John Bolton took on behalf of President George W. Bush at the United Nations, that this country would accept nothing that restricted the constitutional rights of its citizens, and especially their Second Amendment rights. The administration has already signaled to the UN that that's not its position. If this guy gets a second term, we're in trouble. This is the biggest crisis we've faced, certainly since 2000. And I would suggest that it's a more major crisis, because the stars have aligned in a way that if this president is reelected, we are in more trouble as gun owners and supporters of the Second Amendment than you can possibly imagine.
And you're making it very clear. If you're a gun owner and you're not registered to vote, you darn well better be.
That's right. I mean, a lot of people, you know, one of the strengths of America, Ginny, is that this is not a country that's obsessed with politics. Gun owners buy guns to use them, to enjoy them, to collect them, to all of the reasons to protect themselves. They don't spend their time worrying about, you know, their rights, because they assume in a free country their rights are going to be protected. You know, our analysis shows that there are something like 25 million American gun owners who are not registered to vote. That's enough people. Heck, if you get half of those people, if you get a third of those people registered in the right states, that's enough to wave goodbye to Barack Obama and his gun control regime.
Yep.
Well, I know that from now until Election Day, gun owners across America are going to be taking up the challenge, going to be urging and advocating.
Well, if there's anybody listening today that isn't registered,
yeah,
they should get out and do it. And if their neighbor isn't registered, if their hunting buddy isn't registered, if somebody at the gun show they attend isn't registered, they should drag them out there and get them to register, because their freedom is at stake.
And don't you agree? If they don't, they only have themselves to blame.
Yeah, but that's a small consolation to the rest of us.
Yeah, no kidding. NRA President David Keene, thank you again, sir, for joining us in studio. Look forward to doing it again.
Thank you.